Cool. So this is a case that Lily actually picked from my casebook, so hopefully it'll lead for a good round. And given the current dominant ideologies in APTA, should also be kind of counterintuitive. Case statement is 5 words. Nationalism is on balance good.
Can you define nationalism?
Yeah. So we don't want to have anything incredibly hard and specific, but we think it probably encompasses 2 things, which is the actual idea of being like patriotic towards presumably a state, unless there's some kind of counter model. That's how it has been, and probably also the promotion of that to some degree. So usually we probably all agree that nationalism, we're not born being nationalistic. It is a social construct that is being constructed probably continuously. So we'll say both the process and the actual belief and feeling of nationalism is encompassed within this definition.
Okay. And you mean in the present day?
Yeah. So sure. Yeah.
Okay. Lonnie, do you have any questions?
I don't know. Can you give me some examples of states that have like high degrees of nationalism?
The one we're sitting in is pretty nationalistic.
All right,
I'd
probably
say.
fair.
Like it depends, right? Like Russia is incredibly nationalistic. It also gets kind of conflated about whether or not you talk about individual leaders and actual sense of patriotism towards the state itself. Usually developing countries end up being less nationalistic, though not always, because they often try and create hyper-patriotism in order to compensate for other things.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Our first independent point is that a unifying framework is good. And under this, the first thing we want to talk about is why we think that it's inevitable. Because we think that it is just true that humans, and we think we all agree and feel this ourselves, are communal species. That we have a desire and, in fact, an urge to be around other humans and to feel some kind of common identity with them. Otherwise, we would all be individualistic all the time. We're fine making sacrifices sometimes about the people that we care and love about, and thus the concept of nationalism just extends that urge that we already feel to encompass more people, which we think is good. But secondly, we also think that we all just want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, even outside of whether or not it directly benefits us, especially in an increasingly secular world. We think it's incredibly important that people feel like they're building towards some kind of communal project rather than just their own lives. The warrant for this is simple, Mr. Speaker. We are mortals. At some point, we will die. Our family will die, our loved ones will die, the people in these rounds will die. The only thing that keeps us then towards pursuing the good life is the idea and the belief that we are actually pursuing something and building something that is greater than ourselves and will outlast ourselves. We think nationalism is an important contribution to this fact. And we also think that it just leads people to ultimately focus on commonalities in the face of differences. So recognize that it is true that we are all independent human beings. We all have our own thoughts, ideas, experiences, DNA. But we think that while we can keep this in mind, the concept of nationalism forces us to both recognize that this is true while focusing on actual commonalities instead. Focusing on the fact that when I see someone on the street, they may be a different color than me or have a different hair color or like bad music, but we're both American to some degree, meaning that there is some commonality there that we both see, and that's going to be good. But also under this first independent point is that we think nationalism solves what I call the tragedy of community commons, which is that it makes you care about laws that affect others beyond just you and your family. Because recognize that if the only laws that you ultimately see are the ones that impact you and your family, then they're probably going to be the only ones you care about. The only way to change this is to make those that you care about a larger sphere than just you and your family. We think nationalism does this. It allows for sacrifice for social programs such as healthcare and education, and ultimately creates the idea that we ought to give up some amount of our tax money to fund them. And for public jobs, gives the idea that people ought to sacrifice things like pay in order to work for them. It creates the idea that even though I do not directly benefit from this, I still see people across the country as my brothers and sisters, and that I am willing to make sure that they live a better life. We also think this pertains to internal security as well. So we think that it's just true that the state needs nationalism to work. It's just not enough cops to watch you all the time. You need to care about people beyond your own borders and beyond your own family, and you have to want to care about them and the laws because you care about others. We think that it's simply untrue that you're always going to be following the laws because you're worried about repercussions, because it's very easy to get away with a lot of things because we don't have cameras everywhere. Thus, you must believe that the laws in themselves are just, and to believe that the laws are just, you must believe that they come from some sort of just source. And I think the way you propagate that feeling of justness is through the concept of nationalism. Finally, under this first independent point, is why do we think it's good for external security? So we think that wars are rarely, if ever, created by nationalism, but they are caused by security reasons, wanting resources, protection, expansion, and then maybe exacerbated by nationalism. But we actually think that if war does happen, nationalism allows states the ability to protect themselves. And if you believe that there is a threat to the United States, as a threat to you, then you will protect the country. This actually, en masse, creates a deterrent against war because it creates states that have willing citizens to protect and defend themselves. And when multiple states have multiple groups of citizens that are willing to protect and defend themselves, it actually leads to minuscule forms of mutually assured destruction happening constantly, such that it actually minimizes the chance of war, rather than if we just existed in some kind of Hobbesian state of nature, where we all just pursued our own individual interests. So we think it protects yourself, it mobilizes for the collective well-being, and ultimately can avoid things like the draft, which inevitably targets the poor because people are willing to sign up. All these things, we think, makes it likely that you're going to want to care about a collective that exists beyond you, meaning you care about the future, that you want to survive beyond you, which makes it easier to like pay back debts, ultimately have faith in money, ultimately solve things like climate change, because you believe there is a nation that will exist beyond you. So that's why we think that a collective identity is good. Second independent point is why do we think specifically it's better for new states and developing ones? So we think that it helps new states and those suffering with internal divides because it reinforces itself over time, because as more people opt into it, it becomes harder to opt out. We think that the more people that are opting into some kind of nationalist sentiment within the developing state or a new state makes it harder and harder for you to say, I don't believe in this, because you're then going to be raised in it by this sheer mass of people that are buying into the system. We think that this is what allows you to overcome sectarian divides, such as Rwanda in the 90s and South Africa through post-apartheid by actually supporting the rugby team and actually having this rally around the flag effect. So we think that indeed conflict actually comes when nationalism breaks down rather than being caused by nationalism itself. You can see this in places like Yugoslavia. We also think that for developing countries specifically, since rewriting colonial maps is nearly impossible for the leaders of oppressed states, fostering a sense of nationalism is an act of political survival. If you don't believe in if you don't believe that the nation state will protect you, then you will instead retreat to your own family, community, religion, or ethnicity for protection, which things actually divides developing states and doesn't allow them to exist into the future. And finally, under this point, we also think that it can smooth democratic transitions. So in the United States, Republicans and Democrats respect the president to some degree, even if they don't agree with them. They don't revolt and launch an armed revolution every time there's a new president, because they know that there'll be a next election and that they all believe that we're working towards a common good and a common project of America. We think that in the developing world, this needs to be the case too. You need to believe that there is an actual state that you are working towards, rather than just individual administrations. We think it's good to foster that in the developing countries. Third independent point, final independent point, is why we think nationalism is better than other identities. So we're fine defending on our side of the house something different than a complete utopian version of nationalism. We agree that it's going to exclude some people and might lead to some conflicts. We think that's fine. We're not going to kind of strawman the best version of nationalism. But because of that, we also think OP needs to have an open mind and actually a willingness to engage with what the realistic alternatives are to nationalism. And we don't think that any of them are going to actually overcome the benefits that nationalism has. So one example might be a larger multinational identity. But we think that these are problematic because they ultimately lead to larger countries either leading or dominating them, because it is a concept that is imposed by larger states through a hierarchical tier that is higher than them, imposing thoughts and ideas onto them. Where we think that nationalism can actually come internally, as the developing state is allowed to pick the national anthem, for example, and their flag and the sports team and customs they want to promote. We also think that nationalism is just easier to opt into and out of than any other form of identity, such as class or religion. In terms of internal and external recognition, we see this as true. You can't change your race to solve differences. You can't but you can come together under a nation. You can't change the fact that you're black, but you can make sure that everyone has access to being nationalistic. You just do it. You just act more nationalistic. You don't have to be nationalistic, but you can. It's an option that is available to you, while a black woman cannot simply choose to become a white woman or a white man. We also think that you can't change your class when you wake up in the morning, and for most people it never changes, as the cycle of poverty ultimately enforces a lot of the people who end up staying in the lower classes of society. So that's why we think nationalism is important. Even if you buy the ethnicity and race and stuff ultimately good collective identities, we think that unless there's a nationalistic sentiment that ultimately allows a country to exist in the future, none of these sub-identities are going to exist either. Nationalism is good, alternatives are worse. Proud to propose.
Everyone ready? All right. So I think that we can really clearly see what the impact of nationalism is in the United States today. We have created this firm idea of a cohesive national identity, an identity that in many cases is white, is Christian, has a very set state of moral beliefs, and that nationalism, that idea of a cohesive national identity, is what's causing us to turn away, busloads of refugees at the border. It's what's causing us to turn away these Syrian refugees. This idea that there is a American way and that they do not fit into the American mold. I think that's also something that's driving a lot of resistance to criticism. When you can describe criticism of your country as like anti-American or anti-patriotic, I think in most cases nationalism turns into something that excludes people more than it does include people. So while Jerry's rhetoric about how a black person can just believe in nationalism and that makes them joined with the rest of the country is very persuasive when you first think about it, I think upon a deeper examination of how nationalism has played out both in the United States and in all the other countries where nationalism is predominant, just really prove that it's been a way to exclude people more than it has been a way to include people. So the first thing I want to talk about is about how it's sort of what my overview is about, how it creates this in-group versus this out-group thought. The idea that we are us and they are them. I think that when you don't have a nationalist sentiment, when everyone has an individual identity based on perhaps their creed or their religion or their class or anything like that, I think it makes it easier to relate to people in other countries who have those similar ideas. And I think in increasing global connectedness that we have in the world today, I think that that's way more important than building up these individual nation states. I think one of the things that you see with this in-group is people becoming more isolationist and less willing to help people in the world as a whole because they otherize people from other countries instead of identifying their differences. I think nationalism becomes something that becomes predominant over your other identities in a lot of cases. I think that's not something that we want. I think this sort of in-group versus out-group thought also helps to drive, sectarianism and conflict, especially in developing countries. I think it's very easy to develop, a nationalism based on the Hutus, the Tutsis, and the belief that your country should be full of those kind of people, and you're building a national identity based on that. I think that drives a lot of conflict. I think it creates the idea of difference when there is none, and it makes it difficult for immigrants to integrate. We also think it makes it difficult to adapt new traditions into your country, because once you believe strongly that you have this national identity that is better than all other national identities, which we think is very key to nationalism in and of itself, I think it makes it difficult to adapt new traditions into your country that might be better for it. The second thing that we want to talk about is about justifications for actions and for morals. So I think that belief in a national identity does become predominant over other belief systems. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more on case, but I think we've seen that under the guise of nationalism, things like torture have been justified, things like unjust war have been justified, things like isolationism, not helping other countries when they ought to be helped. And the reason why that is because nationalism causes you to place your faith in the actions of the government, overriding what you might otherwise think, overriding your own morals, and I think it causes you to not pay attention to a lot of those. And the third thing that we want to talk about is about the view of the state over other better options. So I think when you buy into nationalism, you're buying into the idea that your state the state as it is today is preferable to any other option. It is preferable to have a United States as opposed to the 13 colonies that are part of Great Britain. It's preferable to have one African country as opposed to that African country being under colonialism, or it's preferable to have one country as opposed to a pact of countries. And the problem with that is I don't think it's always true. I think that there are a lot of times where it would be better for countries to split apart. Like say there's a lot of sectarian conflict over religion or something like that. There are cases in which there would be more peace if they were to split apart. But we also think sometimes it's a better idea for countries to join together, like when you see with the EU. I think a lot of the resistance to joining the European Union or joining the Euro or anything like that has been based on a flawed idea of nationalism, has been based on the idea that, for instance, the English pound is a preferable monetary structure to the euro, regardless of economic sentiment or anything like that. Like the idea that Scotland is better off by itself as opposed to part of that's not a good example, but you know what I mean. So I think that nationalism is driving a lot of people to not opt towards better structures when they could because of this blind belief. So now I'm going to go on cases. So the first thing they talk about is about a unifying framework, right? So I think that nationalism is a unifying framework, one that we think replaces preferable unifying frameworks. We think that people typically only need one framework to focus on. And we think that there's a reason why, like, Hitler or Mussolini used nationalism to replace people's religions or to replace people's moral structures. We think nationalism has continually been used throughout history as a belief structure that's caused people to override what they would otherwise believe. We think that nationalism isn't key to the kind of laws that Jerry talks about. We think that, like, basic caring about other people as people causes people to obey those laws and to institute laws for their own protection or for the protection of others. But what we think nationalism does is replace that basic intuitive caring that people have with a belief in the all-knowingness of the state, with a belief that anything the state is doing is right. We think that's particularly pernicious because when people aren't believing in their own moral structures first, as opposed to the nationalist structure, we think it causes the government, it makes it so the government can do all sorts of really terrible things. We don't think that nationalism is key to the social contract. We think, like, it's clear that the social contracts existed long before nationalism or any idea of nation states existed. We think that social contracts exist because people do want basic protection and because people turn to the state or a government or a tribe or anything like that to provide that protection. I think it's in part of people's self-defense. So the second thing that they talk about is about nationalism and war. I talk about how nationalism doesn't cause war, it's just like an auxiliary to war, but it is key to mobilization. But I think that this is like kind of the same thing, right? So I think that if nationalism, if this fear for your own life or somebody else's life is what's causing you to mobilize, I think it's also going to drive you to war. Because at the point at which you're willing to lay your life on the line for some sort of cause that's greater than yourself, for nationalism, I think that you are also willing to go to a war that's not necessarily justified for that same cause. I think that nationalism has led to a lot of unjust wars, especially because nationalism is something that gets built into your own identity. Because nationalism is something that gets built into your identity, like it becomes, you know, key to your pride or something like that. You have pride in your nation, as opposed to this feeling of just only wanting to join an army when there's self-defense. And we think that that causes unnecessary wars when there's when people want to defend that pride. We also think that it's not necessarily a good thing that it like drives a faith in your group. I think that this causes sectarianism instead of conflict. I also don't think it's necessarily true that it brings groups together. I think a lot of times when you're building this national identity, you build it based on things that only drive people apart, and it makes it more difficult for, like, immigrants to be integrated into your country and things like that. I think a really clear example of how it does that is during the Second World War, when we had the Japanese internment, because there was this idea of a national identity. I think World War II is like exactly where the peak of United States nationalism was, and that is a point where we were putting Japanese people in camps because they didn't fit into our national identity. So I don't think it's true, this third point that Jerry talks about either, about how nationalism includes people and brings them into a national identity. I think what nationalism does is create a cohesive set of beliefs, a cohesive set of ideas that you have to have, and a cohesive look or religion or anything like that you have to have to be part of that national identity. And I think that people don't buy into that, which a lot of cases they can't. And I think that you're only further excluded from your nation. I think what it creates as nations is nations as people with a very distinct set of characteristics that other people must be excluded from. I think that a lot of times in the United States this excludes people of color, regardless of how long they've been in the United States, or people with distinct beliefs. And this is another point that I think is important. I think nationalism suppresses a lot of important dissent that you might have against the state, because I already talked about this a little bit earlier, but because it makes it unpatriotic to bring up challenging ideas, and that only causes a long-term entrenchment of bad ideas, because people are too scared that it's going to be seen as anti-patriotic or anti-nation to speak out against these ideas, which I think is bad for the country as the long run. So I think to build a cohesive nation, you need to not exclude people with this national identity. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Okay. Okay, so let's begin. The first, on their off-case point, the first point they made up in the overview is that they talk about nationalist identity, and then how it causes a country to turn away refugees. We say a couple things. First, we say that nationalism doesn't so first off, they're saying, before they even say that, they're like, nationalism is a set sort of ideal, it's like American, it's like Christian, etc., and it's not going to change because of this, and it's not going to grow. First, we say that nationalism will grow because as more people come into the country, as the United States is a country of immigrants in their example, nationalism will change over time and start to accept these are their beliefs, these are their cultures, and it will become a collective national identity. We're not imposing a national identity because nationalism is brought up from the people and by the people that live in their country. Their second argument is that in this nationalist identity, it causes people to turn away refugees. We say a couple things. First, we say currently the reason that people aren't letting refugees into the country, the reason why people don't want to let refugees in, is not because of this strong national. It's not because they don't feel for these refugees. It's simply because of a misled belief that if they let these refugees in, it's going to actively hurt the country through economic reasons, through people not having jobs. So because of this nationalist sense, they're addressing this. They want to protect this collective security, which we think is important. So we're saying that the reason they're not letting these refugees in is not because of nationalism gone bad. It's simply because they don't understand the economics of what will happen if they let these people in. So they're trying to protect the collective security, but they just don't understand the economics. So it's not nationalism gone bad. It's just lack of understanding of what would happen if we actually let these refugees in. Second thing they say is that if we create an in-group versus an out-group. They say this under this overview. So we would say that it doesn't actually, we say on our side of the house, it creates less of an in-group than an out-group than on their side of the house. Because on either side of the house, there's going to be some forms of identity. There's going to be some forms of identity that exclude or exclude others. So on our side of the house, a couple things to say. One, our side of the house is not based on something on just arbitrarily what you're born like, whether or not you're white, whether or not you're African American. It's not based on race, it's not based on ethnicity, and it's not based on culture. So it's very inclusive in the fact that you're not restricted by enjoying this nationalism based on where you were born. What you were born like. In addition to this, we'll also say that we'd actually make people more empathetic on our side of the house because it's not simply how will this law affect your community, it's how will this law affect everyone in the community. So that's why people buy into things like Social Security. That's why people participate in healthcare projects. That's why we accept the idea of universal healthcare because we recognize that it's important to protect other people in our country because of this sense of nationalism. So it actually makes people much more empathetic on our side of the house. Secondly, they mention like torture and war can be justified because nationalism places stakes in the actions of the government. This is a lack of understanding of what nationalism actually is. It's not a faith in the actual government right now. It's a faith in the country itself, meaning that nationalism doesn't justify the actions of the government per se. It justifies the country itself and the purpose of the country, and it's not an unfettered belief in the government. It's a belief in the state. That is why it's so important, because nationalism will not justify war, because if the government actively takes steps that harm the collective security and the collective moral goals of everybody in the country, that harms the nationalism, then obviously people won't be behind it because the government will not be acting in this national sentiment because the government will not actively be benefiting the country, so it won't be upholding this national sentiment. Yes, they can argue that there might be that people might be marginally swayed to support the government, but in this big justifying war example, that's not going to happen because it's not an unfettered belief in the government, it's a belief in the purpose of the country. Thirdly, they say that nationalism causes people to join together and not form it doesn't cause the countries to join together and form into optimal states and things. First, we'd say that the reason countries didn't join into the European Union or things like that were based off of the collective economic and political goals of that country. So they're upholding their nationalist purpose, and and whether or not that country thought it would most benefit themselves to join in the European Union, and we think that's fine. We think that's a fine decision. Countries have made bad decisions on both sides of the house, but we say that because that was based off of the political advocacy and what the people wanted in that country, we think that if one country didn't join the European Union, then that's fine with us. Secondly, they also argue that they don't really address what happens in developing countries because they give you a bunch of developed country ideas, but this is really important for dealing with the possible political conflict because nationalism is really important because you need to join together these different fractions of groups especially in developing countries, because often these developing countries are just like in Nigeria, for example, it's hugely fractionalized. So you need this nationalism and to avoid these horrifying internal conflicts where the military takes over, things like that, which can cause a lot of destruction. So it's really important that we have nationalism, especially in these developing countries. Now let's go on case. So the first thing we say is that nationalism is good, and we talk about a unifying framework, etc. The response to this is they talk about Hitler and Mussolini, and it imposes morals onto people, and people's own personal morals get pushed aside. Okay, so first off, we talk about the difference between nationalism. It's really important here that nationalism isn't support in one particular leader. This isn't like a cult of personality here. Nationalism is support in the country itself. Secondly, we also say that it doesn't push people's morals aside, because nationalism takes into account every single person in the country and the collective moral beliefs of the peoples in that country. Nationalism does not come from a government saying this is what you should believe. The government of that country comes from the people, and the more collective moral beliefs and the collective feeling and sentiment of that country form the nationalism, because they're all, no matter their race or ethnicity or fractionalism or whatever, are joined together by this nationalizing force, and we think that's good, and that's why we have this good unifying framework. Their second argument against this is that we talk about wars, they talk about nationalism can lead to unjust wars. We say that this, we talk about the difference between a country upholding what we believe, between a country following its like nationalist goals, what the collective goals are for a country, that is good and the people will support it. But the people obviously won't support a country who, we don't think nationalism will go so far as to support like a completely unjust war, because we say two things. So first, if the government, like if the people actually elected the government, we say that because the government comes from the people and their collective moral goals, they won't actually, if it's so unjust that the people don't believe in it, then they won't support it because the government comes from the people. Secondly, we say that even if the government is elected, is not elected, and like if the government isn't elected, we say it's better for the country that they have more nationalism rather than like. And it's better for the country if they have more nationalism, because we argue that it's sort of like a deterrence. If one country has a lot of nationalism, another has another nationalism, because forces are willing to go against each other, it'll serve as a deterrent for actually getting into war. And finally, we'd say an external conflict is probably better for the people than an internal conflict when many factions are fighting into each other, and statistically probably going to be a lot of war. In addition to this, if there's a threatening of an unjust war, we would also say there are things like nuclear deterrence, so it's unlikely, and we would argue that you should weigh against the potential of having this external conflict. Then you should weigh against, like, we say external conflicts. If there has to be a conflict, we'd rather have an external conflict than an internal one, because internal ones will probably be much more bloody. Finally, they mention specifically that it's specific. We say that it's specifically good for new. One other thing. The only other thing they say here is that they talk about like Japanese internment, and they use this big example. They're like, we completely exclude things. We would say that Japanese internment was actually a failure of nationalism, because if it was truly nationalism, if people were really thinking about the collective goals of the country, then they wouldn't have excluded some of the people in that country. They wouldn't have excluded Asian people. So this is just an example of why we need nationalism, because when we don't have nationalism, it causes this fractionalism, it causes blaming within the country, and it causes the country to deteriorate internally, which we think is really worse. And we think, I mean, this was in a developed country. Imagine what could happen in an underdeveloped country or a developing country where its government just got established. That's why you need this nationalism, to set this country up and to start promoting the goals of this country. Finally, we mentioned that it's especially good for new states. They haven't really given any warrants as to why this is particularly bad for new states. In addition, they haven't really given any alternatives to nationalism. They just sort of said why it's bad, but they don't care what else they would like to rely on. Like, if we don't have nationalism, what else do you want to rely on? They didn't give us any warrants on their side of the house. And for all these reasons, we're proud to propose.
All right, are you guys ready? Cool, okay. So what is the purpose of a collective identity? Why do we even need this anyway? We think that humans inherently want to gravitate towards their own small clusters of family units, or their own small individual identities, such as like, we're friends, so I'm going to protect you. We think we need a collective identity that encompasses more people, so we can literally like not tear each other to bits every time there is a disagreement. But we don't think that nationalism is a good unifying factor, because a state is an arbitrary distinction based on where you were born or where you live. We don't think this is actually going to have any meaningful connection between you and your neighbor. neighbor. So if my neighbor and I have nothing alike, except for the fact that we are both American, I'm probably not going to feel any sort of kinship with him, even though we are both Americans, because everyone around me is an American. So instead, I'm going to focus more on the differences between me and him, instead of looking for something that is shared. Because if we rely on this one form of nationalism, saying everyone in America should be buddy-buddy because we are Americans, there's no logical link, besides the fact we literally live near each other, to support any sort of common identity. So we don't think they're actually going to get any of the benefits of people caring more about each other because they are American. One, because everyone around me is American, and I still see divisions within that. But additionally, we don't think there's actually going to be any sort of meaningful link between us, because there's literally nothing in common other than this nationalism sense, which not even everyone opts into. So we don't think they're actually going to get the benefits of that. But additionally, we think that even though nationalism is not going to go away, that it's better to uphold identities that actually unify more people. So we think that nationalism is inherently exclusive to people, even if they want to opt into it. So we think that nationalism, the idea of a true American, or what American values are, or even what the American way is, are inherently exclusive to minorities or people who don't follow that natural path. So we think that people who are people of color, or people who are Christian, because recognize the true American, what people think of when they think of American, is white, middle class, Christian, probably straight, probably not of any sort of minority type. It is seen as the template for what an American should be. And then there are people who literally cannot opt into this system. They cannot change their color to white. They cannot change their gender to something that is normal or considered normal under the American structure. So we think that there's people who are never going to be able to opt in to the perfect American under this nationalist structure. And when you were saying that nationalism is a key thing that is supposed to be unifying people, you're inherently going to be leaving out minorities. So we don't think this is actually a good thing. We think this actually leads to more division in these nationalist countries, because the people who buy into this nationalism as supreme, this is what the American should look like, are going to have more divisions with the people who don't fit into this thing. And that's what leads to the Syrian refugees being turned away. And that's what leads to structuralized racism being a thing, because people are never going to be able to see these unifying factors if they're trying to focus on nationalism. So the first point we bring up on the Ong case is, I guess I kind of already talked about that. But we say that nationalism is promoting in-groups versus out-groups. And I think I've kind of hammered this pretty heavily on my overview. But Lily to this said that nationalism is going to grow as immigrants come, and this is naturally going to expand it because there's more people who are opting into nationalism. What she doesn't see is that people are going to be excluded from opting into nationalism because they're never going to be seen as a proper American or somebody who is actually able to meaningfully engage in this nationalist sentiment. So Americans who do, people in the Midwest stereotypically have a lot of nationalism, they're never going to accept a black person or an immigrant who's trying to opt into this nationalist system because they don't fit into the idea of what an ideal nationalist should be. So we think they're not actually going to get the benefits of expansion. So the next thing they say is that the reason people excluding isn't nationalism. More people are included if you have nationalism, because more people are going to have this unifying factor, and people want to protect the United States from external factors. So I'm going to touch on why that is bad later. But the idea that you want to protect the United States because you are with nationalist countries has actually led to a lot of significant harms for people in the United States and out. So we think that the idea that other identities are more divisive, we don't think this is also true. So maybe my identity is I am a Christian, and there's Christians from all walks of life, right? There's black Christians, gay Christians, whatever. It's not just some one monolithic idea of what the perfect Christian should be. So we think if you're actually focusing on more factors beyond the set of nationalism, and additionally because nationalism is so huge and overwhelming, and it is the thing that you opt into that takes up the most of your identity, we think that is going to exclude people from pursuing other identities. So instead of just being an American, I can be a Christian, I can be a woman, I can be a whatever. So we think that if you're able to pursue more smaller identities, this is going to lead to more inclusivity, and you're going to reach more people than just I'm an American. The next thing we talk about is how nationalism has been justifications for really, really bad things. To which Lily says, this is not faith in the government. Nationalism is not faith in government, it is faith in the country. So the government and the country are intertwined, right? It's really hard to separate a government from a country full of a full-scale revolution. So the idea that nationalism is not faith in the government is just on balance wrong. When you're in a country, the government is the driving authority of what this country's goals are. Like it or not, the government really dictates where you are going as a country. And if you say that, oh, I can just have faith in the country without faith in the government, that's never going to be true because they're so intertwined. So I can't say I support America without also saying I support democracy or the institution of the presidency, because the two are so inherently linked. The next thing she says is that people may be swayed to like support a bad government's agenda, but they're not going to completely override their morals because they're caring about the country and not the government. So when you care about your country so much to the degree that you're going to be supporting it and you're going to have this nationalistic sentiment, you're willing to overlook a lot of the bad things the country has done because you don't want to be seen as unpatriotic and you don't want to compromise this part of your identity. And this is what leads to internment of Japanese citizens in these camps, or it leads to like abuses in other countries, and people like laugh it off because America is the greatest country in the world. So people are not as willing to criticize America because they want to have this faith in their country, and that means they're more willing to overlook the things that the country has done wrong. Additionally, we think this faith in the country is dangerous because if you're putting all your faith in the country as doing the right thing and being a good thing for people, you're never going to be able to meaningfully criticize or have a dialogue about the country's flaws. The third thing we talk about is how if you care about the state too much, you are going to look over better options, like because of this nationalist sentiment. To which Lily said the reasons why countries don't like join together or split apart is because they don't want to, because that's not what the people want. But recognize the people don't want to join together even if it is a better alternative, because people see the people in the other countries as different. They're not Americans. They are not who we are. And that's just recognizing, like, that is ignoring the fact that most people have the same basic values. They probably want safety. They probably want economic stability. So if you're having this arbitrary distinction based on what country you're from, you're never going to be able to meaningfully engage in better alternatives just because you see these people as different, even though they probably aren't. So let's go case side because I'm running out of time. The first thing we talk about is how nationalism makes people focuses on the commonalities and not the differences. So this kind of turned into a discussion between, like, the nationalism is not focusing on one leader, it is focusing on the country as a whole. But we think that one leader is able to manipulate people because of this nationalism. Like, look at Donald Trump playing on American sentiment. Look at Hitler saying, Germany is so great, let's conquer the world. This has led to real concrete harms to people within the country who don't fit into this nationalistic idea. And then also people around, like, internationally, because the nationalist people have been saying, like, you are different from us, so we are okay hurting you. We think this is on balance bad. We think that nationalism makes people support things or more willing to support things that are counterintuitive to their morals because like it's overriding the basic caring you have other people, because nationalism is saying care about the people in America before you care about the people in the rest of the world. We don't think this is good. The next thing we talk about is how so we said that nationalism it is going to lead to more unjust wars because you care more about your identity than you do other people. We said this is literally happened in the past with Hitler, with Mussolini. We don't think this is going to be good. Like, nationalism is not going to turn the wars because people are so wrapped up in nationalist sentiment. They're okay with invading countries that don't share the same values as you. We think this is going to lead to more unjust wars. The second and third things we say kind of got drops, but we think that nationalism is not going to be better for developing states because they already have so much divide. So if you're forcing all this faith into a corrupt government, this is going to have worse political stability. And then the last thing he's trying to collapse on is this is going to be better for other identities. We don't think this is better for other identities because other identities beyond where you are born and where you live is going to be more inclusive of more people around the world. We think this is going to be better. Proud to oppose.
Everyone ready? Is that? Okay. So I want to talk, I think this is like the real question at the heart of this round. What makes people come together as nations? We think that what makes people come together is a social contract. This idea that if you give up some rights to the government will protect other ones of your rights and it will protect the rights of your neighbors. We think that what nationalism does is it replaces the meaningful bargaining calculus of the social contract with blind allegiance to the state, with a blind belief that you should do everything that is best for the state because the state will do what is best for you, regardless of whether it will or not. We think it keeps people from meaningfully interrogating whether what they're doing is best for themselves and best for people around the world because of this belief structure that has replaced everything else. My first question is nationalism an inclusive identity? I think that it really clearly isn't, and I think the historical examples we've given you of nationalism gone wrong can't just be, waved away with, no, that's just nationalism gone wrong, because that is nationalism in all cases. That is what nationalism looks like. We think that nationalism creates a cohesive national identity that changes very slowly and not in response to crises. We think a country is then based on an idea of what is like the American way or something like like that. We think that one of the reasons, for instance, why Jeb Bush says we can let Syrians in if they're Christian is because that is what an American identity has become. As Lonnie said, this white Christian ideal. We think that that kind of identity inherently excludes other people, and it bites into they bite into their own framework when they say, like, oh no, you know, nationalism causes you to care about people in your own country. Right, it does. It causes you to care about people in your own country more than you care about people in the rest of the world. This means you don't let in immigrants that needs it. This means you don't help your allies around the world when they need help. This means that if you're a large power like the United States, you don't intervene in humanitarian conflicts because you don't care as much about people in the rest of the world as you care about your own people. I think insofar as people like in the United States are really well off, nationalism for us is really just a negative force. I think it creates a framework in which people care about their own country more than other countries and replaces other moral frameworks like the golden rule or just basic caring about people in favor of nationalism. I think the collective goals of the country become a utilitarian framework that favors the body counts that you save over morals. And the Japanese internment is an example of exactly what happens when nationalism happens, because, you know, if people believe, like, oh, interning the Japanese is what's better for the nation as a whole, then they're willing to do it even if the Japanese people are their fellow citizens, because you preference that over, like, moral structures that we think is better to believe in instead. I think this replaces connections like family units that get people to form it replaces like family units or religions that cause people to form cross-national connections that we think are more important to preventing war. And I think that this also drives differences between people internally within the country, because as Lonnie so eloquently points out, like, we're all Americans, right? And people like need some sort of group to belong to. So I think it excludes immigrants because you have no obligation to protect those people, and it excludes minorities because you created a national identity. And the third thing I talk about, and the thing I'm going to talk about a little bit in my next point, about how it like keeps you from getting involved in just wars because you don't care about people in other countries because you care about your own country first and foremost. The second question is, does this drive more conflict? I talked about the us versus them mentality this creates, and I don't think this went properly responded to. This creates a mentality that makes you quicker to war if you believe it's in defense of your country, and more so, it does in fact make you believe in the government. I think it's wrong that the government is distinct from the state, because especially when the government tells you that something is key to preserving the country, we think people will be very easily swayed to take whatever action that is and not critically interrogate whether it's like the right thing to do if it seems like it's what's best for the country. We told you this prevents necessary conflict. I don't think this went properly responded to. Their only response to this is, well, it's better to have external conflict than internal conflict, but I don't think there's a forced choice between those two things. I think nationalism can also be used as a force to create external conflict, to distract from internal conflict that needs to be solved. The third thing I want to talk about is how this is bad for developing countries. I think that the belief in you believe in national frameworks that once existed instead of national frameworks that should exist, like in the Israel-Palestine conflict, which like precludes any sort of peace from happening. It also creates the belief that groups that share a common feeling of identity should be nations, which I think drives sectionalism and drives countries from coming together. I think it causes people not to care about their neighbors more than they care about self-protection, because we think that's just what people care about basically. And we think it also prevents joining together when that's clearly a better idea, like an example of the European Union that we give people. I think people care about their neighbors no matter what because of the social contract. But I think what nationalism does is keep people from caring about the world as a whole, and for all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
From the beginning of PMC, I said it does not make sense for either side to defend a perfect utopian version of their world. So instead of a simple three-point crystallization structure PMR, I'm going to talk about what their world looks like, what our world looks like, and be as open and honest about what both sides of the ballot looks like for you. So first, their world. We think that they provided two different alternatives for nationalism. The first was a kind of multinational approach, things like the EU. We gave three responses about why this is problematic. The first is that it's ultimately always going to be led by richer countries, those at a higher tier of the stratification, and not developing countries, because they're the ones that ultimately impose things like the IMF and ultimately loans and austerity, and that's bad for developing countries. Secondly, we said that this also applies to external customs, meaning that they are ultimately imposed without your consent. This was the block of PMC where I said that if you're a developing country and you are fostering internal nationalism, you get to choose your own flag, you get to choose your own national anthem and the sports you want to promote, rather than one that's imposed for you externally without your consent. And third is an argument Lily gave you, which is that nationalism is actually necessary first in order to join any kind of these multinational states, because in order to have the ability to ultimately consent and sign contracts, you have to be a unified force. So that's why that alternative doesn't work. The second alternative we got was kind of mishmash between one thing Geneva said that we'll have smaller colonies, and then another that Lonnie said that ultimately having sectarian divides based on race and religion and caring about your neighbor based on that would be better. Couple responses. First off, we told you that if you just based on like the smaller 13 colony approach, you ultimately have less self-sacrifice. We agree that we ultimately help those that we love, and if that human intuition is true, we think that the correct response is actually to expand the amount of people that we love, and the way you do that is to ultimately have more people included in your social sphere that you include in when you think about your friends and families, rather than just immediately in the own community that look like you. We think that this ultimately leads to better education, welfare, and security. But secondly, we think that all the other alternatives that they gave you related to this kind of micro sense of nationalism, whether it's based on race or religion or colonies, are so much harder to opt into and opt out of. Like, it is very true, I completely agree that it's hard for an immigrant, it is hard for a Muslim to become an accepted American. But it's much harder for them to become an accepted Christian. It is true that it's hard for a black person to become an accepted person in America, but it's much harder for them to become a white person. I mean, that if you buy this argument that it's hard to, like, say, come into America and become accepted into society, you have to buy into the argument that you need to be as inclusive as possible. And since they're giving you no alternative other than saying that being American is, or having a sense of American identity is bad, you have to default to our standard, which is that being American, white, and Christian is ultimately better than just having a system that's white and Christian, because you can at least choose one out of the three to ultimately adapt to. Meaning that it's hard for nationalism to adapt and change, but it's a hell of a lot easier when you say have a bunch of legal immigration coming in here that ultimately changes national identity by fostering things like Spanish education, whereas you never have that at all when you exclude everyone completely because you're white and Christian. The utopian version of Geneva and Lonnie's world simply does not happen. We're all suddenly going to accept everyone. We retreat into our internal insular societies, which we think is worse than something that can actually mold. So that's their world. What is our world? First off, we told you that you get less external war on our side of the house. The reason why this is true is because when you have citizen armies that are volunteering to protect their countries, it creates a deterrent from different states ultimately waging war against each other because they know that there's a country willing to protect them. But secondly, we said that if war does occur through things like security factors and the prisoners and a security dilemma and stuff like this, that you actually don't have to have a draft because you're volunteers, so you don't disproportionately hurt the poor in their side of the house. Another argument that was dropped from PMC. So we get less external war. But we told you that what's most important is you actually get less internal war. So why is this a more pressing issue? So first off, we told you that in PMC it simply is more common right now in the status quo. That you have more internal war than you do external war. The reason why this is true is because it ultimately happens when nationalism breaks down and developing countries ultimately wage war between each other. But a phenomenal argument that Lily gave you that I think was just not responded to adequately in LOR at all, which is that internal war ultimately ends up being more destructive because if it's an external war, you ultimately have two people fighting on a battlefield, whereas internal war, you ultimately have the destruction of all your infrastructure, your bridges, your roads, your people, your healthcare, literally everything is torn apart for decades, which is why civil war is a more pressing issue. And if we're able to solve that through nationalism, it's better. We also think that on our side of the house, in our world, we also get more long-term sacrifice. So even if it is true that on their side of the house they still have some sacrifice based on like communities and families and religion, we told you that those things ultimately disappear. They are mortal. They die. They ultimately go away. Your community will not exist forever. But if you believe that you're building towards a long-term nation project that's going to exist beyond you and your family and those you care about, you ultimately have long-term sacrifice for a whole host of things like climate change and debt, repaying and forming treaties, and ultimately having money that people believe in. That is what's ultimately going to be important and leads to sacrifice going forward instead of just towards one administration. So those are the two worlds. The final thing I want to talk about in this last minute is the developing world, and why we think that this is much more important than every other impact on the ground, even if you believe that they still have some good nationalism or some good self-sacrifice in the West. So the only argument that I think was kind of good that was kind of blurted out was that the West ultimately won't help the developing world because they're only going to care about those. We think that is still true on their side of the house. That if they have a Western world that is just based on Christian white identity, they're still only going to help the West world and not help the developing world either. On our side of the house, we just make it much more likely that they're going to help the developing world because they're unifying around, say, the football field instead of the Christian cross. They're much more likely to see someone as different rather than actually going to hell and being damned. We also think that the developing world is something where they, as I said in PMC, they can't redraw the maps themselves. But that when you have a Shia and Sunni divide, which we think is much more realistic than Geneva's utopia, people die. Women get stoned, and kids get shot, and people are dying right now in the status quo. It is simply true that the social contract, the human intuition that Geneva thinks is going to ultimately save everyone is not happening in the real world. It is a humanitarian crisis that has led to over 300,000 people dying in the Syrian war. That is the failure of nationalism. The way you solve it is to ultimately say that we're not going to be able to redraw the maps ourselves because it's led by European colonialists, and say that given that that is true, we need to unify around something that ultimately allows us to get change through dissent at the ballot box rather than the battlefield. Proud to propose.
Here.
All right, so that was like 25 seconds too long. So
Okay. I timing. I have to go because we're leaving for CUNY in 4 hours and I haven't packed or anything like that yet, and I have a case to write up. But fantastic round, guys.
Go do that.
Good luck.
Cool.
Yeah, good luck.
None of you guys are going to be at CUNY?
No.
Oh, okay. Well,
No, we actually hate debate. That's why Lonnie is on round 18.
This break, yeah.
well, when will we? Are you guys coming to Carnegie Mellon?
Probably
Wait,
not.
what?
Are you guys coming to Carnegie Mellon?
Oh, so
What is the next tournament we're going to? Like, what is that?
Oh, so we actually haven't had a board meeting about it. So are you guys back in school, Geneva?
No, we don't get back in school until UNC.
Yeah, no, that's the first tournament we're back at. So I think we're definitely going to UNC. I think.
So last year, Aaron and I just went to Carnegie Mellon ourselves without our team. That is something I could potentially do. However, I'm probably going to be in New York, so I probably won't be able to do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then I'll see you guys at UNC then.
Yeah.
See you there.
Yes, Geneva. Cool. So what was this round?
Nationalism is good.
Yeah. So figured that out. So, was it me, or did it just seem like? So from my impression, it just seems very like a bunch of nebulous, weird, countering assertions. Like, was there more? I don't know. I wasn't actually listening. Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Oh, so I don't know how clear you expect the round to be where the case is nationalism is good.
So I mean, I think the round is good in general.
I didn't hear what you said.
So I think like that's a problem with the case rather than good, well conservative circumstances. You know?
Oh, I don't think so. I think is choice feminism is good is also very nebulous.
So all right, that's also not great, right?
No, I think it depends, right? That is the entire idea of the advantage of PM. Those cases is what fosters the idea that there is an advantage to PMR speaking last, right? Which is different than pretty technical cases.
I don't know. All right, you all can talk. I don't really have anything to say. I just like you.
Thanks, Malia.
Thanks, Holmes. You do not get credit for giving feedback in this round.
Whatever. I mean, I was just like pacing anyway, and then I realized there was a round happening, so I thought I would come in and say hi.
Hi.
I also texted you about this round too.
Oh yeah, you did, but like I couldn't do it.
And then came anyway?
I couldn't at the time, and then did. Well, mostly I was just sleeping when you were texting me, so I didn't respond.
I'm sorry, I forgot that 12:30 is really early for you guys.
It really is.
I got up at 12 today, actually, so I got up early.
I'll get off work at like 11, and then I'm like can't go to bed until 2 because I'm all like hyped up from all the thousands of humans that are all demanding that I do things.
So Geneva's not here, but I think there are two basic op strategies to this case. One I think you guys did very well, Lonnie, and one I think you guys could have done a lot more of. That Geneva kind of did a little bit of, but didn't warn well enough. Two different op strategies, I think. So first off, I think defending small groups of people running around protecting themselves is never going to be sufficient. Because I think all the things about not having cops and education and social welfare and climate change and money are probably all going to be true. So I think at that point, the two different op strategies is one which I think you guys employed very well, especially in the MO. Which was saying that nationalism is the white Christian identity, and basically saying that we try and say that nationalism is not, and that it's just obeying the state, and you guys say that when you give the state the power, the nationalism that forms is the one that reflects the very racism and religiosity that we think is bad. That I think is a very good approach because it nukes a lot of the offense we have. And turns a lot of our arguments. The second op strategy, which I don't think you guys employed enough of, is so I personally believe like the smaller let's all be colonies and have sectarian divides does not work. The alternative that I think does have a lot of benefits is the multinational approach of the EU, UN, African Union, Pan American states, this kind of approach. That I think needed more warrants to overcome stuff I said in PMC, such as it always going to be led by richer countries that control the IMF, and then it's always going to be external customs ultimately imposed on lower people. So I think that probably I don't know how to generalize this feedback, but I think that did you see that they were basically, so except for what you did, which was good, which is kind of conflating the idea of nationalism. Were you able to see that I think there's two alternative approaches to nationalism? One is a larger image where we have multinational states, and another one is a smaller image where we divide internally into communities based on something else instead of national identity.
I think I picked up on the smaller one. I don't think I picked up on the bigger one.
Yeah. So I think basically just seeing that, which is there are two Lilies on my screen.
This is weird. Lily, why are there two of you?
I only see one of you, so I can't answer your question, Lily.
Okay.
But I don't think it's a real problem.
You look really mad in your other face.
That is unfortunate.
Yeah, so I think this is actually probably true in a lot of cases where someone proposes a plan and there are two alternatives. One is either a smaller micro version of the plan and one is a larger, more macro version of the plan. And you can just basically see which of these is better. The larger, more macro concept, I think, often cannot be applied because it's not always mutually exclusive with a policy case, but can almost always be applied with a normative case. So if I say, for example, I don't know, something about whether or not different civil rights movements should work together. The two different approaches, I think, would be a micro one where you say they shouldn't work together at all. They should all be independent so they get their own donors. And a larger one, you can say that instead of working together, they can all just conflate and become one group because they'll have more leverage and more lobbying. And I think seeing that there is a larger picture and a smaller picture, and that there are two alternatives, allows you to see which one is stronger. And probably the correct thing to do, or at least what William Murray has done in the past, is to have a strategy where LO ends up being a lot spreadier and MO crystallizes a lot more. So in LOC, if you see that there are different approaches, both like a larger, more macro one and a smaller one, you can just throw both out there and say both of these are preferable. And then presumably by MO, you can crystallize more around one and kind of make that the underlying advocacy of the op block going forward. What did you think about this case, opping it?
I don't know. I noticed that the second and third points on the on case just got dropped out of the round until PMR. Probably not good. I think like a lot of the benefits that you're saying just like aren't true.
So I think the only thing that makes this case remotely interesting is the argument that the burden that PMC puts on OP to find an alternative. That nationalism is good not just because it is good, but because it is better than anything else that can exist. I think most of those alternatives in the third point, where I waded through why it's even harder to opt out and to opt into those acute communities, I think probably were not responded to adequately enough by LOC. But did you think this going into your MO that there wasn't enough ink on the second and third points?
Yeah, so I was like originally going to like say something, right? Because I don't have anything written down. But then I spent too long on the overview and I ran out of time, so I didn't do that. So that's just like a time management thing. Yeah.
So I think you just have to see whether so I think there are some good things and some bad things about my PMR. One good thing about my PMR is that I think I recognized that there was not a lot of engagement with the second point, which is why basically I gave it its own minute at the end about why it's good for new states to form. So I think just seeing where there has been less engagement over the 45 minutes and just putting more effort there is probably beneficial. And the alternative might be true when you're goving, right? If someone doesn't engage with something a lot, you can either extend it in MG to make it more powerful, or to hope that it does not become as important and as clashy so that you can collapse on it to some degree in PMR, which is what I had hoped to do in PMR after your MO did a pretty good job, I think, conflating the idea of nationalism with some kind of ethno-religious sentiment. I thought was tight.
You can stop saying things are tight in the context that they're good and when you're talking about debate, because
Yeah, that's getting confusing.
and it's just going to create a lot of confusion. You like get up in the middle of LLC and be like, guys, this is such a tight case when you really like the case, and then everyone's confused.
Oh, so people make that fun a lot at the top of LSC. They'll be like, man, this idea is so tight.
Probably not the best.
Oh, it's awful.
Because then no one knows for the first minute and a half what's actually happening.
Maybe that is the strategy. Lily, what did you think about your speech?
I didn't think it had like huge glaring issues. I didn't think it was horrible. I should have reinforced what you were saying more, because like when they didn't address some of the points, I just sort of ignored that and moved on. But I should have said they didn't address this, and I should have like legitimately said it. I think that would have been a better idea. I don't know.
So if this was a real case that I actually had written out, then presumably we would have like MG blocks and extensions and new examples, and then if something was dropped, you would be able to fill in that information. Which is why I made a post on the Winter Prep page that MG blocks, or what we conceive of as MG blocks, don't just have to be responses to op arguments. You can also include things like new examples, new extensions, that I think are incredibly useful when LO drops something, because then it gives MG an opportunity to add to the round in a way that's different than just repeating PMC.
Okay.
So for example, we probably would have had more. You probably would have been able to give examples such as how. So I think an example. One thing that I think you did well throughout your MG was basically explaining a lot of the impacts that they said will cause for nationalism are actually nationalism breaking down. So it says Japanese internment camp. I thought that was actually really good analysis. We would have had more examples like this, like Yugoslavia, the conflict, the internal conflict caused there was not caused by nationalism, but a breakdown of nationalism, so that people were treated to smaller ethnic communities instead, and that caused a conflict. And you would have just been able to extend based on examples there. Obviously, we're doing like a lot of blind MGs in rounds, but I think in general, if someone drops something from PMC, you should probably say that it's dropped. And even if you don't have like new arguments and warrants to add to it, it's usually not hard to come up with new examples. And I think coming up with new examples and adding them to the flow is a way to make your speech seem more substantial without just repeating PMC, and actually gives you something to do as well. That's probably true for basically any case, right? Like if there's a case about how cost takes away from welfare, instead of just saying that, you can add new examples about all the different types of welfare programs that might be cut if government's plan or opposition's plan costs a lot of money. It was not tight. It was dope. Lonnie, you seem upset. Are you upset?
I just don't think my speech was very good. I'm gonna watch it again later. I'm also sick, so not in the best mood.
What?
Guys, I'm writing a case right now, and it's almost done, and it's going to be super great. Who wants to have a round with me? Like, it doesn't have to be right now, but
Is it your mandatory arbitration case?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope, it's about Latin America.
I'll do a round at 7.
7's probably not great, because a friend of mine's, or basically a bunch of my friends' friends from school are coming in, and we're all going to be hanging. So I can't do 7. But
I imagine that somewhere in the 20 groups.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm just going to post. I'm off tomorrow until... No, wait, I'm not. Never mind. All right, whatever. Cool. It's going to be really good, though.